If you are over 60 and you are still investing like a man who has 30 years to recover from a serious mistake, I think you are playing the wrong game on the wrong field with the wrong scoreboard. That is the first truth. The second truth is even harder. Most people do not know when the game changed. They still think investing is mostly about maximizing return. They still talk about getting ahead, beating inflation, finding the next great winner, staying aggressive enough to keep growing. That language belongs to an earlier season of life. When I was younger, I could make a mistake and repair it with time. Time was my silent partner. If the market punished me, I could keep earning, keep saving, keep compounding, keep waiting. If a position disappointed me, I still had decades to let discipline do the repair work. That is not where many people are standing once they cross 60. At that point, the question changes. You are no longer asking, how rich can I become from here? You are asking, how do I make sure the life I built cannot be quietly dismantled by one bad cycle? One bad inflation wave, one bad rate regime, one bad decision disguised as sophistication. That is the right question. And most portfolios are not built to answer it. What I have learned after watching markets for most of my life is that money tends to be lost in retirement. For a very simple reason. People keep using an accumulation strategy after they have entered the distribution phase of life. They still behave like builders when they have become stewards. That identity mistake destroys more wealth than most recessions. I want you to picture retirement not as a victory lap, but as a bridge. When you are young, you are still gathering materials. You are still pouring concrete. You are still building the thing. You can afford some noise, some detours, even some mistakes in engineering. But once you are on the bridge itself, the objective changes. You are no longer trying to build more bridge while standing on it. You are trying to cross it safely, with dignity. Without the structure cracking under your feet. That is how I think about investing after 60. Not as a race car, as a bridge crossing. And a bridge crossing requires three things. It needs a floor that does not rot under inflation. It needs cables strong enough to survive financial strain. And it needs traffic lanes that still move, even when the weather turns ugly. In plain English, that means 3 layers of truly defensive investing. A layer that protects purchasing power. A layer that provides dependable, low-drama income and preserves principal. And a layer that still owns productive businesses with enough stability and pricing power to keep paying you through hard years. If you miss even one of those layers, you are more exposed than you think. The mistake most people make is assuming safety is a single product. They ask, what is the safest investment? That question is too childish for the problem. There is no singular safe investment. There are only assets that do certain jobs well in certain environments. The task is not to find one magical answer. The task is to assign the right jobs to the right dollars. The first job is preserving purchasing power. The second job is preserving optionality. The third job is preserving income. You would be amazed how many people arrive at retirement with hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of dollars, and still have no idea which dollars are doing which jobs. Everything sits together in one big bucket. They call it their portfolio. I often think it would be more honest to call it a pile of accounts, a pile of mutual funds, a pile of inherited habits, a pile of things their advisor once called balanced, a pile of stories they have repeated so often that the stories started sounding like analysis. That is not a system. A system explains itself. A system can tell you why each piece is there, what pressure it is supposed to survive, and what danger it is meant to neutralize. That is the kind of thinking I want from a retirement portfolio. I do not want a pile. I want a structure. Let me start with the first wall of that structure, because this is the wall most people misunderstand. They think inflation is an annoyance. They think it is a line in a government report. They think it is something the Federal Reserve will eventually say a few serious words about and then solve. That is how people think right before inflation takes a decade of comfort away from them without ever announcing itself as a crisis. Inflation is not simply rising prices. Inflation is the silent conversion of your life savings into a weaker version of itself. It is the thief that does not smash the window. It just keeps taking a little more from the pantry every year until the pantry no longer feeds the household the way it used to. That is why I care so much about Treasury inflation-protected securities. Not because they are exciting, not because they will make you feel like a genius at dinner, because they do one job with unusual honesty. They acknowledge that a retiree does not merely need a nominal return. A retiree needs purchasing power. That distinction is the whole ballgame. If a man tells me he made 4% while inflation ran at 5%, I do not say congratulations. I say you lost ground politely. That is what most retirees fail to appreciate. They think in dollars instead of in purchasing power. They look at a statement and see the number did not fall very much, so they assume they are fine. Meanwhile, their grocery bill, utility bill, property tax bill, insurance bill, and medical bill are all telling them a different truth. The statement says stable. Life says weaker. I trust life. That is why I want part of the bridge anchored to something that adjusts with inflation, not something that merely hopes inflation will behave. Tips do that job better than almost anything else I know. For a person who values clarity over drama, they are not a promise that your life will become lavish. They are a promise that the measuring stick itself will not quietly shrink while you pretend to be secure. That matters enormously after 60 because your margin for replacing lost purchasing power gets narrower every year. A younger man can offset some inflation by improving his income. He can work longer hours. He can change jobs. He can build a business. He can save more. A retiree usually does not have those levers. He needs his capital to defend him, not metaphorically, literally. That is why I would never allow all of my supposedly safe money to sit in plain nominal promises and call it prudence. If inflation becomes more stubborn than the experts promised, those nominal promises reveal their flaw. They pay you exactly what they said they would pay you, and it buys you less than it used to. That is not safety. That is stable deterioration. Tips are the first wall because they say no to that deterioration. They do not solve every problem. They are not immune to volatility and market price if you trade them at the wrong moments. But they start from the right philosophy. They understand that the first duty of retirement capital is not bragging rights. It is preserving the real value of a lifetime of work. Now let me tell you why this matters even more than it sounds. Inflation after 60 does not just reduce comfort. It reduces choice. It reduces choice in a very cruel way. You do not notice it at first. You simply postpone a trip. You say no to helping a grandchild the way you hoped you might. You defer home repairs. You become more hesitant around medical expenses that earlier would not have frightened you. Slowly, the world becomes smaller. That is what inflation does when retirees underestimate it. It narrows the map of possible living. I do not want that for myself, and I do not want it for anybody I care about. So yes, I want a serious allocation to the inflation wall. Boring is fine. Predictable is fine. What matters is that the wall stands there doing its job while the rest of the world argues on television. Now let us move to the second wall, because this is where a great many well-meaning people destroy capital while calling themselves conservative. They buy long bonds. They buy duration. They buy whatever sounds dignified and fixed and respectable. They think the word bond is synonymous with the word safe. That was understandable in a different era. It is lazy in this one. A bond is not automatically safe. A bond is a promise, and the longer the promise stretches, the more violently its value can swing when interest rates move against it. That is arithmetic, not ideology. I have watched people put long-dated fixed income into retirement portfolios because they like the label, never stopping to consider whether the interest rate environment actually made that label dangerous. When rates rise, long bonds can behave like very fragile creatures dressed as old men. They look calm until you surprise them. Then they fall hard. If you are 40 and collecting for another 25 years, you may be able to live with that. If you are 71 and drawing income from the same pool of money that just took a brutal mark to market hit, your relationship with duration becomes much more intimate. That is why I prefer the second wall to be built from high. Grade corporate bonds and short, strong promises rather than long, elegant fantasies about stability. I want credits from businesses strong enough to honor their obligations through bad weather. I want established companies with balance sheets that can still breathe. I want cash flows that do not depend on perfect conditions. I want issuers that have earned the right to borrow my money because they have already proven they can survive real cycles. This is not the place for reaching. If you reach for yield in retirement, yield often reaches back for your throat. That is the thing people discover too late. They get irritated by low yields. They start telling themselves they deserve a bit more income, a bit more yield, a bit more efficiency. Then they wander into junk bonds, fragile preferreds, exotic income products, leveraged credit, real estate structures they do not understand, and all sorts of dressed up trouble. They do not call it greed. They call it optimization. The market is not fooled by vocabulary. It knows greed when it sees it. And retirement is the worst season of life to disguise greed as prudence. So the second wall must be honest. It must admit that income is useful, but principle is sacred. It must admit that a slightly higher payout is not worth a dramatically higher chance of permanent pain. It must admit that simplicity has defensive value. A bond from a dominant, financially strong company that throws off real cash and can survive a recession is not glamorous. Good. I want less glamour in the income wall. Glamour belongs in magazines and bull markets. I want obligations from borrowers whose solvency does not depend on a friendly social mood. That is the right spirit. And I want the maturities managed so that my optionality keeps returning to me. Optionality is an underrated luxury after 60. A short maturity is not just a technical preference. It is a kind of freedom. It says, my money will come back soon enough that I can respond to what the world becomes. I do not need to trap myself in a 20-year forecast to earn income. I can be paid while keeping my maneuverability. That matters because the future is under no obligation to remain consistent with the assumptions of the present. Now, this second wall does something else for you that few people appreciate. It calms the nervous system. Retirees do not need only return. They need sleep. A portfolio can look respectable on paper and still make its owner miserable if it forces constant emotional vigilance. I want an income wall sturdy enough that when markets become foolish, I am not tempted to become foolish with them. That emotional function is part of the return. The best structure is not simply the one with the mathematically highest expected output. It is the one you can actually live inside. That brings us to the third wall, and this is where I part company with people who think safety means giving up on owning businesses entirely. I do not believe that. I believe a retiree still needs some connection to productive enterprise, not because excitement is necessary, but because inflation does not sleep, and pure defense can become its own trap if it never participates in real economic productivity. But you must choose the right kind of business. This is where the phrase dividend stock gets abused. A dividend by itself does not make a company safe. If anything, retirees are often lured into dangerous equity because the dividend looks pleasant and the story sounds mature. I do not care that a company pays a dividend if the business underneath it is fragile. A yield can be bait. I care about the quality of the underlying cash engine. I care about necessity. I care about pricing power. I care about whether the customer can realistically stop buying what the business sells when the economy gets tighter. That is why I gravitate toward defensive dividend, paying businesses in utilities, consumer staples, and healthcare. Not because those sectors are incapable of trouble. Everything living in markets is capable of trouble, because the economics of necessity are kinder to the retiree than the economics of hope. A family may postpone a new car. It does not stop buying toothpaste. A household may cancel a vacation. It does not decide electricity is optional. A patient may cut luxuries. He does not cut the medicine keeping him stable. That is what I want from the third wall. I want businesses that remain invited into the household budget, even when the household budget becomes defensive. That is the essence of pricing power. Not the ability to behave arrogantly, the ability to raise prices and still be needed. That kind of business can transmit inflation outward rather than swallowing it whole. That matters more than most investors realize. A weak business experiences inflation as suffocation. Its costs rise, but it cannot pass them on without losing customers. Its margins shrink. Its balance sheet gets tighter. Its investors wonder what happened. A strong defensive business experiences inflation differently. It may not enjoy it, but it can often adjust prices and preserve enough margin to keep the income stream alive. That is a retiree's friend. A dividend from a company with real pricing power is a different animal from a dividend paid by a shaky company trying to look mature. One is nourishment, the other can be bait hanging over a trap door. I have seen far too many people over 60 reach for the prettiest yield and then act surprised when the stock collapses and the dividend gets cut at the exact moment they needed dependability. That is not bad luck. That is bad selection. I want long histories. I want conservative payout ratios. I want products and services with embedded demand. I want management that thinks like custodians rather than showmen. I want businesses that can walk through a recession without becoming dramatic. Boring becomes beautiful after 60. You finally understand why. Now, let me tell you about the 5 retirement errors I most want people to avoid, because these errors are not random. They spring from one underlying confusion. People want to preserve capital, but they are emotionally addicted to the language of accumulation. The first error is yield chasing. I have already touched it, but it deserves a harder diagnosis. Yield chasing is what happens when a retiree stops asking, "What is the risk to my capital?" and starts asking, "Why am I not getting paid more?" That mental pivot is fatal. Once income becomes the only thing a person sees, risk begins dressing up as relief. A dubious bond yielding 8% looks attractive next to a strong bond yielding 5%. A leveraged real estate structure yielding 10% looks attractive next to a stable utility yielding 4%. People forget that a retiree does not need income alone. He needs sustainable income with survivable drawdowns. That is a different thing entirely. The second error is market timing. Retirees especially are vulnerable to this because fear is more persuasive when time horizons are shorter. They tell themselves they will just step aside until things look better. Then the market turns before their emotions do. They wait more, they buy back higher, or they miss the recovery entirely and spend the rest of retirement with a scar where confidence used to live. I have never met a timer who described his own behavior as panic. He always described it as prudence. The results usually translated the truth. The third error is overconfidence from success in another field. This one is common among doctors, business owners, engineers, lawyers, executives, and highly competent people of every kind. They built success elsewhere, so they assume competence is portable into every financial arena. Sometimes it is, often it is not. Public markets are their own world. Humility matters there. A great surgeon can still be a terrible credit analyst. A brilliant entrepreneur can still be a weak judge of valuation. Success in one domain does not grant immunity in all domains. Retirement portfolios are too precious to become arenas for ego extension. The fourth error is lazy diversification. A person owns a little of many things and mistakes quantity for diversification. Or he owns the same economic bet through several wrappers and calls it balance. Or he allows old concentrated positions to linger because they are familiar. Familiarity is not diversification. If a single regime shift can wound most of your portfolio at once, you are not diversified, no matter how many line items appear on the statement. The fifth error is tax blindness. Retirement is not simply an investment problem. It is a cash flow choreography problem. What sits in taxable accounts, what sits in tax, deferred accounts, what should generate ordinary income, what should compound more quietly, what should be held for flexibility. All of that matters. Yet many people think taxes only during filing season and wonder why their elegant portfolio feels less elegant in real life. Now, let me add something that most market people do not discuss enough when speaking to retirees. Longevity changes the math. When I was young, living a very long time sounded like an uncomplicated blessing. By 60, you realize it is also a financing problem. A healthy retiree can easily need his capital to work for 25 or 30 years. That means the portfolio must do two seemingly contradictory things. It must remain conservative enough to avoid devastation, and it must remain productive enough not to be eaten by time. That is why the three-wall structure matters. Too much defense without productivity leaves you weak against inflation. Too much productivity without defense leaves you exposed to sequence risk and panic behavior. The art is in the combination. That is also why I dislike the phrase risk-free. There is no such thing. Cash is not risk-free if inflation is alive. Bonds are not risk-free if duration is wrong. Stocks are not risk-free even when they are defensive. The right question is not what is risk-free. The right question is what risks am I consciously choosing, and are they appropriate for the job I need this money to do, that is grown-up investing. And it leads back to the same principle every time. Assigned jobs, inflation defense, reliable income, defensive productivity. Once you start thinking that way, a portfolio stops feeling like a bag of products and starts feeling like a structure built on purpose. That is the only way I know to make retirement money behave with dignity. Now I want to be direct about allocation, not because percentages are universal, but because vagueness helps no one. If I am over 60 and relying meaningfully on my capital, I want the inflation wall to be large enough that I can feel it working. That may mean 40 to 60%, depending on other income sources, pension strength, Social Security, and temperament. If a man has plenty of stable outside income, perhaps the inflation wall can be smaller. If he depends more heavily on the portfolio, that wall probably deserves more weight. I want the income wall solid but selective. 15 to 25% in high-grade corporate bonds from truly strong issuers can make a lot of sense. Not because that number is holy, because it gives me dependable, disciplined income without forcing me into desperation. Then I want 20 to 30% in defensive dividend. Paying equities, carefully chosen, not spray, painted across whatever paid a dividend this quarter. Enough to keep productive ownership alive, enough to let dividend growth and pricing power help me over time. Not so much that I mistake equity exposure for sleeping medicine. These are not commandments. They are examples of how the bridge gets engineered. Different families will need different tolerances, but the principle is stable. The closer you are to depending on the bridge, the more you should respect structure over ambition. Now let me say something else. A retiree should keep liquidity. This is not negotiable in my mind. You need 6 to 12 months of true living expenses in something very near cash, very short bills, or a high-quality cash equivalent. Why? Because life has a cruel sense of timing. Cars fail during market drawdowns. Roof leaks appear during recessions. Medical surprises happen when your risk assets are temporarily humiliating you. If you do not keep liquid reserves, you turn ordinary life into forced selling pressure. That is an avoidable insult. Liquidity is not laziness. Liquidity is anti-panic. Now, you may hear all of this and say it sounds boring. Yes, that is one of the best compliments a retirement strategy can receive. The later innings of life are not improved by cleverness that can ruin a decade. They are improved by enough calm structure that you can actually enjoy your days. That is the hidden purpose of defensive investing after 60. Not merely to keep the statement alive, to keep your life unshrunken, to keep you from becoming a servant to market moods, to keep your dignity independent from whether a stock index is behaving itself this quarter. I have seen wealthy people live anxiously because their portfolios were structurally wrong, and I have seen less wealthy people live peacefully because their portfolios were structurally honest. Structure matters more than status. Always. Let me leave you with the mirror test I would use. Look at your portfolio and ask 3 questions. If inflation stays hotter than the experts promise, who protects me? If rates stay higher for longer than Wall Street keeps predicting, who protects me? If the economy slows and the market falls, what continues paying me without forcing me to sell at the worst time? If your portfolio cannot answer those questions clearly, then it is not as safe as you think. Safety is not the feeling you get from a familiar product name. Safety is the ability of a structure to keep doing its job when the environment turns rude. That is the threshold. That is the contract. That is the bridge test. I would rather cross that bridge on strong cables, plain steel, and conservative engineering than on stories, yield fantasies, and fashionable optimism. At this stage of life, getting rich is no longer the point. Staying whole is the point. Staying liquid is the point. Staying paid without staying worried is the point. And if you build those 3 walls correctly, that may be the closest thing to truly safe investing that this world will ever offer.